Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. My name is Forrest Brady. I'm here with Jason Reïmuller, who is a former director at NASA, and he also heads something called Project Possum. He is a atmospheric data scientist, and he's going to be able to give you a lot better of a rundown of what he does than I am. So Jason, why don't you go on ahead and tell us a little bit about where you come from, what your story is, and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Forrest. My background is in upper atmospheric science called Aeronomy. It's a term that is fairly new. So we try to educate people about the upper atmosphere, in particular, why it's important that we know more about the upper atmosphere. And my background has always been something to do with space. Always grew up with a aviation family and was motivated by Apollo and the NASA missions at the time, and
How old
kind
were
of
you
followed suit.
when the first NASA or when the first Apollo mission?
I wasn't born yet. And the first Apollo mission was 1967, though I was probably a few months old when Apollo 17 took off from the moon. So
So
certainly
that's
something.
okay.
Yeah, certainly something I grew up with and very much influenced me growing up with a career aviator with my grandfather, who was a B-25 pilot in the war, and
Wow.
always grew up with his stories. And in fact, he was later fictionalized by Joseph Heller, who served under him in World War II, when he wrote the very famous book Catch-22. He based all the fictional characters on real life, the people that he'd served with, my
Wow.
grandfather being the
One of those characters.
wing commander at the time, who was fictionalized as Colonel Cathcart. And needless to say, my grandfather never thought that much of Captain Heller following from that. But that's kind of the environment I grew up in, and followed his interests in aviation and space. And let's see, I went to school for several things related to that, and ended up working on the Constellation program with NASA for about 6 years or so, doing system engineering.
And
And,
what was the purpose of the Constellation program?
well, the Constellation program was to replace the shuttle. It was to go onto the moon, ultimately to Mars, and it was canceled in 2011. So, this was a very flexible architecture. Elements of it still remain with the Orion vehicle. Um, but that was about the same time I was doing concurrently with studies in upper atmosphere science at the University of Colorado. So I kind of came into University of Colorado with a bit of a physics background and a bit of flight testing background, and they were preparing to launch a satellite. So they were a part of a consortium called AIM, and that was an acronym for Aeronomy of Ice in the Mesosphere. Aeronomy, again, being upper atmospheric science. Ice in the Mesosphere, well, basically, this was a satellite that was to study these things called Noctilucent Clouds. And I was like, what's that?
Yeah.
So these are clouds that are like space clouds. These stratify about 83 kilometers high in our atmosphere. To put that in perspective, the typical stratus clouds that we typically see are probably only a tenth as high as these, the highest clouds that we can see otherwise. So they form in a part of our atmosphere where the air is about 1/300,000th as rare as it is down here at sea level. So it's amazing you can see anything at all. But I knew I like space. I knew, I like flying. I love polar regions, and that's what they tend to form. So sign
Mhm.
me up. And so I got to work with the AIM satellite, and it launched in 2007. And I was curious to find ways to do concurrent observations with aircraft. And that became essentially my dissertation, where I got a small aircraft and instrumented it with some camera systems and flew it up in a small town by the Alberta Northwest Territory border called High Level. And it was a location that was ideal to view Noctilucent Clouds, and also had some fairly benign flying environments there. It wasn't over mountains, and it was fairly good conditions to fly. Um, so um, So eventually, Constellation was canceled in 2011, and that was about the same time I wrapped up my program at the University of Colorado.
Okay.
And when presenting the results of this dissertation research to the Aeronomy community at a conference called LPMR, it's Layered Phenomena in the Mesopause region. So that's a really geeky name, I know. But so the mesopause is the top of the mesosphere, and the mesosphere is on top of the stratosphere.
Okay.
So
So it's like the second to last one before space?
yes. So you have the troposphere that it gets colder as you go higher, and then eventually you get to an altitude where it starts getting warmer as you go higher. That's the stratosphere. And above that, you have this region of about 50 kilometers to 100 kilometers where it gets colder again. And about 100 kilometers is the top of the mesosphere, and that's the coldest part of our atmosphere. And that's where these ice crystals can form. And we think that they grab on to meteoric dust, like extraterrestrial particles that come in, and this dust and this water vapor that exists up there, this water vapor starts to aggregate on these dust particles, and they form these ice crystals, and the ice crystals fall, and when they get down to about 83 kilometers, the air gets too warm for them, so they sublimate back to gas.
Okay.
So that's how we can pretty consistently view these clouds up at about 83 kilometers.
So you
It's
can't
because of
actually
this.
physically see them when they're formed. You can only see what the chemical compounds break down and produce.
Well, you can see them because they nucleate up at the mesopause, but the crystals are way too small to see there.
Gotcha.
But as they start to nucleate, they get heavier, so they start to sink in the atmosphere. And as they sink through more water, they grab more of this gas and sublimates into the crystal, the ice. And it finally, as it grabs more and more, it becomes heavier and it accelerates more, but then it's accelerating into warmer and warmer air. So finally it gets too warm, about maybe 145, 148 Kelvin, for it to support itself anymore. Then it just sublimates back into gas again. But it's the biggest particles right at that lower level before it gets too warm is where we see it, where these crystals are big enough to visualize.
Okay. Now Kelvin obviously is way off of even Fahrenheit or Celsius. You're talking about warm and cold. You mean not only in an atmospheric content, but also in a molecular content. So nothing in the way that you and I or the average Joe views. Oh, it's cold out here. Even sub-zero temperatures. Oh, that's really cold. Or even 120 degree weather that we consider the hottest day on Earth is totally different from what you're talking about, correct?
Sure. In perspective, say 140 Kelvin, well, that's maybe about 130, 135 degrees below 0 Celsius.
Wow.
So the temperature is very low. The air is so rare, so there's no way anyone could survive there because your blood would simply boil out of your body at those temperatures. And that happens as low as about 60,000 feet. We call it the Armstrong line. So to actually do science above the Armstrong line for a human-tended experiment, you have to be in a spacesuit, which means for us, we have to design instrumentation that one could use in a spacesuit. And spacesuits can be cumbersome. You're working in pressurized gloves, so your vision is limited. So when we look at doing a particular kind of science, and particularly with some of these commercial spacecraft that have been conceived for tourism, we realize that this is a good opportunity to do science in a way that is a lot more cost effective and a lot more, and enables some very unique measurements.
Definitely.
So we want to get people thinking away from just going as tourists and finding ways to engage people in science. And I think we find a lot of the people that get involved with our program, they don't want to be tourists. They want to do something meaningful. They
So
want to
that's the
do
Possum
science and
program.
communicate science. Yes.
And could you expand a little bit more about the Possum program, where it started? What are you guys doing now?
Sure. So Possum started this conference, the Layered Phenomena in the Mesopause Region Conference, LPMR. So it's a subset of astronomers that look at Noctilucent Clouds and other things that tend to stratify up there, like metallic layers and air glow. So, but we showed the results of this airborne research in 2011, and two particularly impressive individuals that are incredibly well published, Dr. Dave Fritz and Dr. Gary Thomas, said, well, why don't we put a proposal to a flight opportunity to use one of these spacecraft and do the same where you could actually go up and fly through one of these clouds. And in doing so, if you fly cameras through it, you can build 3D models.
Cameras? Wow.
Mhm.
Okay. Not like, do you guys, whenever I immediately pictured that in my mind, I imagine you guys flying through it with some type of collection system. But do you guys like test tube samples of the of the air?
Well, not really. You can't. That would be a very difficult measurement to try to actually grab those particles. Instead, we use remote sense methods. So that means is well, one measurement is our cameras, and there we can see features of those clouds that we can't see from the ground and we can't see from satellites.
So are they
Very
special cameras that are designed specifically to pick up these particles, or are they just like cameras you would see on a movie set?
well, they're visible cameras, but they're specialized cameras. So they're monochromatic cameras that are designed to have like a burst mode and high resolution because we really want to look at these turbulence and instability, these fine features. So basically, it's not necessarily the clouds that are important, but using the clouds as a way to visualize the dynamics of the upper atmosphere, to look at how winds, how the sun's energy interacts with the energy from the earth, the energy rising up in these waves and like waves breaking on a beach. All this we find that this region of our mesosphere is the most dynamic, most sensitive part of our whole planet.
Wow.
And we think that in order to understand things like global climate, these small changes in our environment as a whole are going to reflect themselves greatly in this region. But it's a region we know so little about, just because we haven't been able to study it. We haven't really had the vehicles. We haven't had the technologies. We've had sounding rockets, but the measurements you could do from a sounding rocket is limited, and they're very expensive too, because you build this whole payload for one shot, and you have to spend an awful lot of money to go find your payload after the rocket.
Maybe we
But with
should
these,
get SpaceX on that with their reusable rockets.
maybe, but they're looking at orbital, going to orbit. They're looking to go beyond orbit. But some of these suborbital vehicles, the Blue Origins, the Virgin Galactics, now they're looking at repeating these flights multiple times in the season. Now that's a game-changing capability there, because now you have a lot less expensive, more repeatable way to access the mesosphere. And not only can you do stabilized imagery, that you can do tomography, like building a 3D model, like a MRI builds a 3D representation of a person. Um, we would like to do that to the structures of Noctilucent Clouds, and in doing so, really observe the dynamics, momentum, and energy transportation through the upper atmosphere.
Now, quick question in regards to that, since you brought up those Blue Origin and Virgin, those commercial tourism flight. Obviously, when we send a rocket out into space, now if I got the wrong idea about this, please correct me, because like I said, I'm just the average Joe here. I'm speaking for the people who are ignorant on the subject. If you send a rocket through into space, I would assume that would poke some kind of hole. I would assume that would poke some kind of hole in our atmosphere. Is that correct?
Um, Not really. Now, you always create, like anything going through a fluid, you're going to have a wake behind something.
Right.
So we're really, again, we're not trying to sample things directly, but what we want to look at is ways we can observe the dynamics, but also measure temperatures, aerosols, and we can do this where we're not affected by the vehicle itself. One example is a LiDAR, a laser, and it can shoot laser beam out, and some of that laser is going to scatter off of what it hits, and some of that scattered um, laser beam energy will come right back to that instrument, and we can measure that. And that's one way we can tell temperatures by using a method like that. We can also look at aerosols, like the charged and neutral particles, like how many particles are up there that this water vapor can nucleate upon.
Okay. And so that's how you judge like the chemical content in the atmosphere, by seeing what sort of chemicals bond to the water when they fall out.
Yeah, there are remote sense methods of looking at chemical composition as well through spectrometry. So by looking at very particular wavelengths, we can look at the way the sunlight reflects off of the, uh, the chemicals in the upper atmosphere. And the sunlight will be absorbed and then re-radiated, and different chemicals radiate at very particular frequencies. So
Based on their
through the same
frequency.
way, we can determine how much water vapor or methane exists there, or other metals in the atmosphere too. But water vapor and cold temperatures, that's where the clouds come from, and that's the changes in that are why we think we're observing changes in these clouds.
Okay, so let me ask, with the future advent of space tourism, obviously it's not only Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos who are all over this. There are people in China and Russia and India who are also doing this as well. Even Israel is supposed to have a moon mission in 2019. Do you see the increase in rockets going through the atmosphere being as big of an impact to the atmosphere as what we're doing right now, given fossil fuels, over domestication of animals, and all the other things that we're putting into the climate right now?
Yes and no. It depends on the rocket. The space shuttle engine, its fuel was hydrogen, and its oxidizer was oxygen. Its byproduct was water vapor. Um, so, I mean, that's a really difficult question. In some ways, these rocket technologies are enabling, much more sustainable technologies too.
Right.
However, the boosters on the space shuttle, and that was atomized aluminum and ammonium chlorate and a binding agent. Now that wasn't good for the atmosphere. That threw a lot of aerosols into the atmosphere. So I don't have a quick answer for that. Again, it depends exactly on what you're launching. And that's a dilemma too of science. Everything has a footprint. And when we do airborne campaigns, we're studying things that we want to study how it affects our global climate, but we're spewing hydrocarbons out of the aircraft exhaust and doing that. So there's an old saying: we're all part of the problem, we're all part of the solution. What are we affecting and what we do?
Right.
And
I guess it just
so
makes me wonder, like, how is it, do you guys ever have to worry about inaccuracies in your data because of, just the randomness with which chemicals can be dispersed in the atmosphere?
well, we're not really making those particular observations. So right now, the vehicles haven't flown yet, so this is hypothetical.
Okay.
What we have done is we've just finished a NASA-funded balloon mission called PMC Turbo. This is exciting because this is the first dedicated balloon to really look at these fine structures of Noctilucent Cloud.
So you
It
weren't
took off
actually in
earlier this.
space?
The balloon went up to about 38 kilometers high. So
38.
that's kind of in the middle of the stratosphere.
Okay.
And but
Just
it,
on the
it
edge.
it was about, kind of in the middle. So it's about half the way to the clouds, but more importantly, it's over about 99.7% of the atmosphere. So the ability to image features above it that revealed features we could not see from anywhere else. Um, so, and then the other thing that we did concurrently with Possum, and this is an extension of our airborne work, we being a citizen science program with a number of our students, we did an airborne campaign out of high level where we had a number of students observing from the ground with these cameras, and then a flight team in the aircraft, and we would fly up in an unpressurized plane to 21,000 feet at night and image these clouds from the 2 ground stations and from the airplane in a way that we look to get tomography.
That makes me have a quick question. What do you find to be the best conditions for observing atmospheres, day or night, during certain storm conditions?
Observing Noctilucent Cloud from the ground?
From anywhere.
Certainly. So it has to be in the summertime. Counterintuitively, the summertime is the only time it's cold enough in the upper atmosphere. So, and so we can observe these clouds from maybe 3 weeks before the solstice, maybe about 7 weeks or 8 weeks after the solstice. So right now we're observing these clouds quite well. The other thing you need to do is be at high latitudes, but not too high. So you want to be in an area where the sun is about 8 or 9 degrees below the horizon. So at high level, at this time of year, right at about local midnight, about 1:30 a.m., the sun is about 8 or 9 degrees below the horizon. And that is why we can observe these clouds. If you go too far north, there's just too much light, and you can't see the clouds. And if you're too far south, well, the clouds then are in the shadow of the Earth, and you can't really see the particles that the sun is scattering off of. But if you're right in that band, and you can see this maybe between 55 and maybe even up to 63, 64 degrees of latitude, then you can have some pretty powerful Noctilucent Cloud displays in the season.
So it's almost like light shining through a window of like an old attic or something, and just being able to use the angle of the sun at the right time during the right time.
Partly. Think about think about the sun that is set. It's like a civil twilight, like a dark civil twilight. Now these clouds are so high. Like anything in photography, it's all in signal to noise. Well, the signal, what we want, is the sunlight bouncing off the ice crystal as part of this cloud and coming to our camera.
Gotcha.
The noise is sunlight coming and bouncing off of anything else and being in the camera. So ideally, we want all the atmosphere, all this potential noise below the cloud in the shadow of the Earth, where the sun comes directly to the cloud and comes to our camera, but none of the other sunlight can scatter off of the atmosphere below the cloud.
So you have to be in one particular layer of the shot. You have to be in the layer of the cloud, and you have to be right at the right angle in order to get, the shot without all of the other atmospheric noise, as you call it, in the shot.
Right. Yeah. So we want to be at the right latitude during the right time of season, so that around midnight during the night, there's a period that the sun is roughly between 6 and maybe 16 degrees below the horizon, but ideally around 8 or 9 degrees.
Gotcha. So is there that? It seems to me like if you're camped out in one location, you say that you spend a considerable amount of time in Colorado. You wouldn't be able to do a lot of work year round. So I assume there's a very tight knit community amongst your field due to the global nature of the work that needs to be done. Do you all share your data in a very open sourced kind of way?
Sure, absolutely. Like all science community, there's a synergy, and we work, better together here. So, typically in this time of year, like now, we're seeing Noctilucent clouds over the north, but then in around January too, we see them over Antarctica and the south. There's always data that we're seeing season to season. So yeah, typically this is a busy time of the year.
So this is your prime time, as it were.
I'm sorry, this is a program for.
This is your prime time, as it were.
Indeed.
So, so,
This is
so, so when you're gathering your data, I guess do you ever I mean, obviously you worked with NASA, or you worked for NASA. You were employed by them. But do you ever still collaborate with national governments in order to sort of raise awareness or push the agenda of getting people more aware of climate change, or trying to push for smarter legislation, cleaning up the environment? Do you have anything to do with that?
uh, yes, I think So, and I'd worked with NASA, a separate program. This was uh, a human space architecture. So, Project Possum, we emphasize as a citizen science organization. So we look at different avenues. Typically people think of citizen science as volunteers, enthusiasts, amateurs that are getting data for for the professional scientist in the ivory tower.
Gotcha.
We want to show that we can produce publishable, peer-reviewed science independent of government, that our culture, our society can support that. We see an enormous amount of money being spent on entertainment and sports, and why can't we be so entertained by science? How can we find ways where companies that are in line with our mission would want to brand with us as a science organization? Um, Media content consumers would like to promote the human stories behind the science, the adventure, the story, what we do, why people should care. Uh, that's what we're trying to change here, is put this human element, engage people from around the world. We've had people in our program from 31 different countries now. Um, People that are students, junior scientists, professionals, or professionals in other fields. We find ways to to, uh, to support each other and do research. And I think this is especially important now. Um, as an independent nonprofit, we can easily cut through. We're not burdened by larger agendas. We can work internationally. We can work through institutions that might be more competitive otherwise. We aren't dependent upon the political cycles that give funding or grants. So we have members that can access public funds in other countries, or we can find ways to privately fund research. And we've been quite successful in doing research that would have been otherwise cost prohibitive, and finding ways to find different private investments into the research, through sponsorships, through media, and then ultimately by support of the members. We find ways that we can provide educational, creditable education services directly from the industry experts and professionals, without the overhead. Our students aren't paying for a football stadium. They're everything that comes has almost no overhead, goes right to supporting the research, or directly to supporting the instructor's direct salary. So really trying to find different ways to get students directly involved with mentors and engage them in science. And we think that has a particular strength in science communication, because when we were doing science on public grants and we'd go to LPMR or other conferences and we talk to other aeronomers, but it really doesn't get out as much. Here we can bring in people from all different cultures and countries, and they're able to share their own human story, their own involvement, and that serves our community as aeronomers, because they can explain what we do and why we do it, and why people should care about the Mesosphere or Noctilucent Clouds or Aeronomy. Most people have never even heard those terms. So,
I hadn't until I met you.
well, that's a failure of our community then, and that's something we hope to change because
So your view on science in the media is that there's not enough of it, or that it's painted in a certain light that makes it unattractive to people who might want to pursue it as a career.
um, so when you look at science conferences, you can go to AGU or some of the major conferences here, and there's certainly differences of opinion, but there's certain consensus too. But when you look at interests too, the mainstream. I don't want to use that term. Media often is biased in ways uh, that's influenced by other external opinions. So one example, you brought up climate change here. You think about all the science that was out showing how hazardous smoking was to health in a previous generation. But the industries that were profiting from this knew all they had to do was create a little bit of doubt. And as long as the public thought that the verdict was still out, they wouldn't vote to change.
Mm.
Um, so they're not playing to win; they're just playing for a stalemate. And all they have to do is create a little doubt for that stalemate and create a
Stalemate
verdict still out. hmm
Yeah.
So, so I think that similar thing is here. Scientists have often been branded sometimes as having their own agenda. Well, a good scientist is is as unbiased as possible, and it's something that we aspire to professionally. We all carry our uh, own biases just from our life experiences. That's just unavoidable. We're all human. But what as professionals is very important to try um, to carry out science as transparently and without bias as possible, and with respect to a peer review process.
Okay, so as far as it seems like you're painting a really good picture for citizen science. But let's kind of steer the conversation, and we're gonna go back a little bit to what you were talking about earlier with Blue Origin and Virgin, and I mentioned SpaceX. Um, how do you feel about corporate science in the sense that well, let me just preface this by saying I'm a huge fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson.
hmm
Obviously, you know who he is, and his opinion is that it's not the responsibility of corporations to pursue scientific exploration or to gather important scientific data, because it's not a one, it's not a it's not a good investment. The odds of success are limited. He doesn't think that SpaceX or Blue Origin should try and be the first one to colonize Mars. He thinks that's a job for NASA, because the return on investment is bad, and it's not a good investment, so people aren't going to invest in it. And that's why government institutions are there to do government research, is because you need capitalism won't invest on things that don't breed profit. So in that sense, do you feel like citizen science turned corporate science is a good method for us as a nation to be chugging forwards along in the space race?
No, I think you're hitting some really important topics when you say that about bias and interests. In corporate science, what are the intentions of corporations? Well, yeah, you know, like you mentioned, there are financial incentives to many. Now, others may be interested. For example, the sponsors that we look at taking on are are interested in branding with us, the image, and that's great. We have people that support members that get through that might not otherwise be able to, and if they're work is congruent with ours, we're happy to bring them on as a partner, as a supporting partner, as an investing partner to our mission. So that's all and good. So yes, there is a important role um, in funds to nonprofits, funds to organizations that don't have a particular agenda. And I think it's very important that these are either government funded or funded outside of this is my personal opinion here. Outside of buying it, the interests of financial gain. Um, so that said, we're very happy with the sponsors that we have. We always try to find a way to show their products or their services as a way of forwarding our mission. Many are happy to support education and science. It's good for their brand, and we're happy with that. So it's just a matter of alignment. There's certain companies that wouldn't be in alignment. So it's a case by case study. But generally education, if you look to a community, if you build a plant and you're looking for technical expertise, and we come as a company and say, well, we want to train a number of undergraduates here at your local university and get them hands-on all these technologies, from remote sensing instrumentation to spacesuits, and get them in the field and do research. Well, if I was a CEO of a large company that just invested in that region, I think it would be a great idea to invest in a small little nonprofit that I could help write off of our corporate taxes and develop a more science and technology literate workforce in the area. So, it's all in alignment. It's finding the right partners that are willing to brand and be a part of our mission.
Right. So but scaling that up a little bit, let's say, a colony on the moon or a colony on the Mars. Do you feel like that's the responsibility of one entrepreneur within a country, or do you think that's that's a burden that a whole nation should bear?
Well, the concept of nation is changing too. Historically, yes, these are things that have been taken on by nations. Are we looking at this as a more global endeavor? Should we be emphasizing this as something that maybe the UN could lead, or things that more of a collaboration of nations should do? What are our investments and our return?
Sorry, this might sound like a stupid question. Does the UN have its own space program?
Say again?
This may sound like a stupid question, but does the UN have its own space program?
Well, they don't have a space program, but they have an office of outer space affairs. So different things that deal with international law.
The
they
ISS
deal
and
with
whatnot.
Partly, regulations in which that operates within.
Okay, but so as far as whether or not one nation or the UN should be handling exploration of the sciences, take the Large Hadron Collider, for example. Let's not even talk about space colonies. We could have had that here in the United States. It was supposed to be in Texas, but instead it was in, I think, Switzerland, Geneva, right? And and something like 100 and something nations contributed, both with its experts and financially in it. And we discovered, as a scientific community, a great amount about particle physics, the Big Bang, and we now, as a scientific community, know a lot more because of that. But that's considered, I guess, along your lines of what you were talking about, of a human accomplishment, and not necessarily in a Cold War sort of space race sort of first person to the moon sort of endeavor. And you feel like that's the way that we should be moving towards?
Well, even looking back to the great national explorations, from from polar conquests to the space race and on. These are still financially motivated, even by nations. When you look at the space race between the U.S. and the USSR, this was about perceptions of economy. This was about driving technologies, innovation in companies, the perception of U.S. products, the perception of the U.S. dollar, the influence it exerts over other economies, other geopolitical interests in the world. You look when China first launched their first taikonaut, almost overnight, the view of economy in that region of Asia shifted from Japan to China.
Yeah.
So this is something at a very broad level. Now, I want to sound doom and gloom about this the pervasiveness of capitalism. I definitely have my critiques of that system for sure. But the but still, the kind of impetus that would be required for such grandiose missions is, I don't know how that's going to realize itself until, usually historically things come down to natural resources and control of natural resources. So, when that becomes more evident, I think there's going to be more of a corporate interest in that. I hope that there is still the human drive to be able to realize the tangible value to inspiration and education and the commitment of a population, nation, or more global to do these things on the intrinsic value of becoming a multiplanetary species and understanding the planet that we live on better. So
let me, I guess I'm not really, I want to get something out of you is kind of what is what I want. I guess my problem is I see these millionaires / billionaires, Branson, Musk, and Bezos. They're heads of corporation and they're spending personal money, not just their company's money. And yes, they are getting tax breaks. So the government is, to a certain extent, financing space exploration. But as far as I know, NASA doesn't have a Mars colony program ready. They don't have anything on their website about colonizing the moon or colonizing Mars. And China, the government of China wants to do it. The government of Russia wants to do it. Like I said, Israel's got its own moon mission. Yes, it's just a visit, but we have governments around the world that are seriously putting their countries, they're setting aside money from their nation's budget towards these endeavors. And I don't see the United States doing the same thing. I see the United States letting capitalism sort of lead the way. And in that same observation, I also see us falling behind in the space race.
No, you're totally right about that observation. I think that's exactly the problem here is that we're not making long-term investments. There's the political instability. You look at countries like China; they're able to look generations in the future, and that's what they're doing. They're looking at securing the investing in the technologies that might not be able to be realized for decades. They're securing resources that they know are going to be needed in the future. They're thinking way ahead of, they're flying ahead of the plane rather than catching up to it. And I think we get in a cycle here in the States where we've kind of devolved into this 4-year return on investment, 4-year political cycle, and we're not having confidence in long-term investments. We want that easy in, easy out attitude. And I'm very concerned that the U.S. is not going to live up to the potential that we need it to be as uh, as a world engaged in tasks like exploring and colonizing space and truly understanding our own world here.
And saving our climate.
Indeed.
So, leading into that, given your field, given your expertise, given how hard you're working to bring awareness to the world about, the importance of the fragility of our, not only our atmosphere, but our climate in general, of our planet. Your thoughts and opinions on us. I know this is late news, but your thoughts and opinions on us Trump leaving the the Paris Agreement, the new heads of EPA and whatnot, and new heads of NASA. Thoughts and opinions?
Well, I can't really speak to that more as just a fairly literate individual here. We study an aspect here of the upper atmosphere. We hope that we're going to inspire people to get more involved in science and in doing or communicating science. We think that increased understanding of our mesosphere will help understand our global system in a particular way, but there's so many other factors we need to study. The atmosphere is what we change directly. When we pump CO2 or methane, that affects our atmosphere. Our upper atmosphere can change drastically to small changes in that. But what does that mean? What are the effects of a warming climate? How does it affect circulation of our oceans? How does it affect
Yeah.
our rainforest and all these other things? Our glaciers are a great observable of effects of a warming climate. So these things are all interconnected,
Right.
and it is really impossible for one person to speak at a professional professional level on all of these. So we try to tie in these observations, and it's very important that people that can integrate, that are literate enough in these to kind of understand what's happening and how it might connect to observations from other natural science research communities, and find ways that we can communicate honestly and effectively, what the science community is learning, and in a way that that people always can trust the interests of the scientists that are representing them, that we serve our communities, our countries, our world, and try to be the eyes to to what's happening, and try to work with our communicators um, that can effectively communicate to the people that need to know, being the constituents in our democracy.
Right. I'm really, really glad that you mentioned that. There's a little bit of an argument as to whether or not, and I'm sure you've seen in the news, there are a lot of scientists who are running for office in this country, and their logic is that we need more scientifically literate people in office. And I don't know how you feel personally about Ben Carson. I'm sure he was a great surgeon, but he doesn't seem to be doing too hot in his position in politics. So I guess my question here is, do you agree with the movement of more scientists running for office, or do you rather think that we should instead just simply have more politicians who are scientifically literate and also willing to take feedback from the scientific community? Do you feel like we actually need more scientists in office, or do you think that just scientifically literate politicians is enough?
Well, it's a tricky question. I think, we need science-informed policy. What makes a great leader? What makes a good president? What makes a good senator? People that can effectively synthesize all of these inputs and make a decision based upon a wide range of opinions. And so I think whether that person is a scientist themselves, or whether that person knows how to select people. Barack Obama, he was a community organizer, but he certainly picked people that were scientifically literate to speak on things with respect to science. So no, I don't think you have to be a scientist. Um, I think you need to represent effectively your community and be advised by people that can speak on the top of their field, whichever that may be.
Right. Okay. So, immediate follow-up question to that. So you also mentioned being extremely honest in your data. Now, you mentioned earlier in the video your distaste for profit-seeking scientists who are willing to falsify data, such as from the tobacco industry and the alcohol industry, I think you mentioned. What about turning it on its head and the dramatization of science, or the idea of making science sexy for the media in order to promote the study of science? I mean, obviously, we've got all these sci-fi shows. We got the superhero movies about, falling in tanks of radioactive waste and, Iron Man suits and everything. And
Right.
we've got Lost in Space, all the new Netflix shows. Every other Netflix show now is about space travel. Do you feel like that any kind of publicity for the scientific community is good publicity?
Well, we need outreach. We need honest, open outreach. And again, this is a fine line. Now, if we dramatize the science, but as long as the science and the message is okay, it is honest and uncompromised, there are different ways to reach different communities. And I think this is honestly a part where artists can and should work in the science community. And we talk more about STEAM than STEM. Well,
right.
I've become more of an advocate of STEAM because your science is only as so STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And there's been a movement to go more towards STEAM, which is the same except the addition of A for art.
A for art. That's perfect.
And my thoughts on this is your science is only as good as how well you can communicate the science. So include people that can become science communicators through whatever medium, art or however, but people involved in a science mission that are not only enabling the technologies like the engineers do, or the mathematicians do, or the technologists do, or the fundamental scientists ultimately leading the investigation, but the people that are going to communicate this to all sorts of different populations that need to know what these investigations are about. So dramatizing things. Well, it's about what we become entertained and interested with about,
Right.
when you really look at these football, like I can't for the life of me see how anyone can sit through 3 hours of a basketball game. That simply bores me to tears.
Right.
But people do it. They pass the ball around and, people cheer. And so why can't, we've had people from all sorts of cultures, chasing these space phenomena and flying in planes. And we just finished this project with the Canadian Air Force where we had this, where we were flying the supersonic jet way up into the North Canada, chasing these observations that may or may not show up.
Tell me a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, and this is, and we've had citizen science where it was a part of a group called Science in the Wild, and the three of us flew up in a small plane and skied up the glacier that maybe has only been skied up 5 times before, the Coronation Glacier on the Penny Ice Cap, carrying spectrometers and samples. Like, if you can't find a way to make this entertaining and captivate people, we don't have to get into, exactly what wavelengths our spectrometer was using, but people can get the gist of it, and we can emphasize, what we're feeling and thinking, and, make drama out of it, entertaining, engaging drama, but we still stay true to what we're doing as science and what we're communicating as science. We're not making fishtails about our science, but we can emphasize that we're humans and we're doing this and we want to share and educate, but also there's nothing wrong with entertaining at the same time. So it depends on the population you want to reach. Some will appreciate a much more technical, in-depth talk, and some are looking much more for entertainment. And if we can impart a few seeds and a few things about what we do and why we do it there, that's great.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That's I really like that response. I've got a couple more questions. Nothing to do with that though. I mean, that was really the you said it better than I could have. So just some follow-up questions, just to kind of wrap up our interview here. I had a really great time, by the way, Jason. I don't know if you did, but this was very informative. Thank you very much. Um, as far as your constellation program goes, you said that it lost funding and it was canceled. Do you have any particular insight as to why it might have been canceled, and whether or not you think that a program for revisiting um, Mars and the moon will come up again from NASA soon?
It's hard to say. I don't know. The focus of NASA, I find often it's being used as a political football and keeping programs in politically sensitive areas and states. To really commit to a flagship program like this, I think we need to change a few things. I think we need to look at long-term investments and a commitment nationally and globally to doing these things. What does that mean? Well, partly it means we have to be more or less risk averse. When we went to the moon, Apollo 8, people gave them a 50-50 shot at coming back alive, but we justified those risks because of the perceived threat of the Soviet Union.
Right,
I think
right.
the threats that we face now and understanding our climate, and the ambitions to settle Mars, these are things that are going to require risk. And frankly, people are going to die in the way, and that's something that we have to be comfortable with, and
You
we
don't really think
have
that
to.
people are willing to risk their lives? They don't have the same mentality of self-sacrifice in the view of a Soviet threat as opposed to a climate change threat.
I think many people do and are willing to accept those risks, um,
But not the
to the
nation as a
border of
whole.
naivety. Certainly, you see that people sign up for a one-way trip. I think that's ridiculous. I like what Wally Schirra once said: "It's to the moon and back, no hyphens, no no periods." So, but we understand that there's going to be risks, and how um, you know, but we have to manage these risks sensibly. We can't just naively go about saying, "Well, we'll do this," you know, whatever. But we have to uh, accept that we're pushing some boundaries, and we do so, and we will learn as we go, and sometimes we'll learn from our mistakes.
That was a great
What
answer.
what we
Um,
can avoid are political mistakes and the political schedules that had killed the crew of Soyuz 1 and had killed the crew of Apollo 1.
right. Yeah, we can't let bureaucracy take lives, definitely. Next question. The You mentioned an Armstrong line, and you mentioned that there are these different layers with which one can study different atmospheric levels. Obviously, you specialize in the Mal- Martus Mar- saying it wrong, aren't I? Noctilucent Clouds. Is that what it was
Mhm.
called?
Noctilucent Clouds, yes.
Noctilucent Clouds. So have you? What's the highest up you've ever been personally? I know I caught a great Facebook photo of you in the jet. I think that was in Canada, wasn't it? Um,
Yeah, I think that's the highest. It was about 45,000 feet. So,
so you've
um,
never actually had to work in a spacesuit above the Armstrong line studying atmospheric data?
no, I've worked plenty of times in a spacesuit as part of testing the spacesuits,
Right.
but not above the Armstrong line. Now, we have simulated that in altitude chambers,
Okay.
not to those pressures, but we've tested people when they've allowed to become hypoxic and their ability to manipulate and work the spacesuit, so basically make themselves safe.
Right.
And so we've tested spacesuits with our partners at Final Frontier Design. We use the spacesuits to help influence our instrument design, which influences our science. And then we help them mature the technology of their spacesuits through different tests, through simulation, through zero-G aircraft, to high-G aircraft, to chambers, to
Right.
post-landing sea survival, spacecraft egress. All of this is citizen science with our Possum members.
So does your Possum program do any atmospheric study that involves you actually working in the suits, or is it just test stuff on
Well, in 2012, we were awarded a flight opportunity with NASA, and that inspired a
wow.
lot of people to get involved. And that would have been the first human observation of or human-tended experiment, and it had to be a human-tended experiment. You simply couldn't, you couldn't automate something you can't see from the ground or from space. So we figured out, how do we actually train somebody or educate someone to do this mission, and that became the program we teach down at Embry-Riddle, is to learn how to do Noctilucent Cloud tomography, how to do science from commercial spacecraft. And a lot of our graduates get involved with Aeronomy work or our bioastronautics work. How we test and qualify spacesuits.
Wow. Okay, so last question. If you were in front of a 8-year-old kid, guy or girl, doesn't really matter. I think we need more women in science. And you were at a booth for a career fair with your atmospheric data gathering apparatus and showing them all the cool tricks and whatnot. What would you say to that child to get them inspired in? I mean, not necessarily, even if it's not atmospheric data science, just to get them inspired in the field of science altogether. What would your message to kids be to get more engaged?
Well, I would find somebody that person could see, that could relate to, as as a peer, as a mentor, someone that they could identify as a community, so they feel represented in that. And then I would uh, encourage them never to be disencouraged, no matter how far-fetched their dream could be. Now, being selected for a Mars mission is absurdly rare, but having that dream is going to create the kind of person that's going to help change the world, help do something. They're going to inspire the kind of education that's going, and curiosity that's going to serve you for a lifetime. So, even if you don't make what dream you think you have when you're 8 years old, well, when you're 28, when you're 38, you're going to be the kind of person that's going to realize all the opportunities that you can't even think about, you know, at that time, because who knows where we're going to be, 20
Right.
or 30 years. So the other thing I would say is, to nourish what you're called to do. Not necessarily in what you think is that one ambition, but all these other interests that come together somehow seem to always play a part in life. So if you find curiosity in something you think may be completely different or disparate, um, there's a lot of people that just try to be something, to jump through the hoops and get the degrees to be some predefined position in life. But the real game changers are those that nourish all these different callings, all these different interests, because a synthesis of all of that is something really unique.
Jason, wow, I've got to say, you've been a very enlightening conversationist. I've got nothing but good vibes from you. Thanks so much for being on with me. Go on
No
ahead
problem, Chris.
and tell the world what you've got going on. Obviously, I'm going to link all of your projects in the description below. But just for the viewers who don't look down at the comments, why don't you go on ahead and tell us what you got going on with your Possum program? Anything else you might have?
Sure. For those that are interested in getting involved, it's projectpossum.org, and we have programs twice a year at Embry-Riddle. That's how people get started with our program, and educators and scientists and you know operators and artists, all sorts of different people. And so, yeah, check us out.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jason. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you next time.